in an effort to uphold the fundamental rights of citizens. However, these unscrupulous individuals have embarked on a violent and unauthorized protest which has led to the loss of lives of innocent Sierra Leoneans, including security personnel. It is also reported that public buildings, including police stations, have been attacked and burnt down in various parts of the country. Therefore, government wishes it to be known that as a country of law and order, these violations are unacceptable in all their forms. Consequently, government hereby declares a nationwide curfew with effect from today, Wednesday, 10th August 2022, commencing at 3 p.m. Government reaffirms its commitment to maintain law and order, including protecting the fundamental rights of the general public. The security sector has been authorized to fully enforce.
That was the Vice President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, Mohamed Jallow. Now, joining us from Freetown, the Sierra Leonean capital, to discuss this and more is Abdul Malik Bangura, a media consultant in Sierra Leone. Good evening to you, Abdul Malik.
Good evening, Gbenga. Good evening, all.
Now, Abdul Malik, can you bring us up to speed with the situation in Sierra Leone? We just heard from the Vice President there, Mohamed Jallow. What's the latest, and what's the cause of this riots that has led to loss of lives in the security forces and also civilian lives? And has President Julius Maada Bio addressed the nation yet? Where is his whereabouts?
President Julius Maada Bio arrived in the country yesterday night after he was on vacation when this unfortunate incident happened. That was why you find out that it was the Vice President, Dr. Mohamed Jallow, who declared the curfew from 3 p.m. to 7 a.m. this morning. And in addendum to that, the police had issued out a statement yesterday at around midday, reaffirming the statement already issued by the Vice President, for which they themselves had said that the curfew which was pronounced yesterday is going to continue and will be from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. until further notice, which means currently it's just past 6 p.m. Sierra Leone, we are fastly approaching to the hour of curfew, and at 7, everyone should be indoors. It is a blanket curfew, which is not imposed in a single part of the country. Although the riots yesterday, we are mainly focused in the main opposition heartlands, which is the north and the east of the capital, Freetown.
Now, Abdul Malik, permit me to come in here, Abdul Malik. You just mentioned the curfew. I want to know if the curfew is holding, and there are some that believe, you know, this is a ploy by the opposition to take government. They've termed it a coup d'etat. I believe the Sierra Leonean Minister of Youth referred to those demonstrating as terrorists. What do you make of all of this? Is there a political angle to this, and is the curfew holding?
Well, the problem with our protest in Sierra Leone is that there is no known ringleader for this protest. It is very unfortunate, to say the least, but all those that were out in the streets yesterday, there is no identified group that is sponsoring this particular protest. We had a protest yesterday, but there is no group that is behind it. But the reasons why most of the ruling party elite are accusing the main opposition is that the protests are in the opposition areas. But the main opposition had issued a statement even before yesterday, distancing themselves from any planned protest and telling the supporters to remain calm and that they are not going to support any planned protest in the country. Today, all the other opposition parties had issued statements, including the Coalition for Change, the National Grand Coalition Party. All of them had issued statements distancing themselves from this particular protest.
What about the main opposition group in Sierra Leone, the APC? Have they issued a statement distancing themselves?
Yes. The APC, in fact, even before, that's what I mentioned, even before yesterday, even before the protest yesterday, rumor we are around saying that there should be a protest. The APC had warned its supporters not to go to the streets, saying that they are a peaceful party, they are not going to support any planned protest. Even today, they have issued a statement this morning, let me say, sympathizing for the lives that are lost, and saying that they distance themselves in entirety to this protest that is ongoing. So it is a situation of us having a protest without leaders.
Now, Abdul Malik, yesterday the internet was cut off in Sierra Leone for about 2 hours, and it was cut off overnight, according to Internet Observatory net blocks. What's the situation with the internet in Sierra Leone? Has it been restored? And what was the reason behind the government disconnecting the country from the internet?
Well, there is no statement from government saying that they disconnect the internet. But according to a statement from the independent company that is managing the fiber optic cable, which is providing internet for Sierra Leone, they said that they were on repair maintenance of their fiber optic lines. So that was why there was an internet shutdown.
Do you believe that?
Stuttgart, which is the company, made that statement.
I mean, it's quite a coincidence that the internet maintenance, the fiber optics maintenance happened at the same time where protests were going on. Now, let's look at the current situation. You said President Abdul cut his vacation short and is back in the country. What is the current situation of things in Freetown and other parts of the country? And just before I let you go, is the government doing anything to assuage the sufferings of people in Sierra Leone, where half of the population live below the poverty line, and they're complaining of soaring prices of commodities?
The president came back and he has still not addressed the nation. But according to findings, the president was having some security meetings today at State House. Although, let me say, more than half of the offices or the private sector businesses, including companies, are closed today. So lots of them are not at work. So the situation is, I heard the president is having some high-level security meetings with security chiefs to know what the situation is. But in Freetown, it is very unusual for you to see high patrol of security personnel in the streets. But that was the case today. I'm just driving out for about 5 kilometers from where I am staying.
But are there still demonstrations? Are people still protesting?
Are out there in the streets.
Are people still protesting at a scammed return to Freetown?
No, there is calm, but there is also fear that they might come again. There is calm. There is absolutely calm today. Everywhere is quiet, but there is this wave of fear in the minds of people, because what they saw yesterday was very unusual of Freetown. Owing to the fact that we all know that Sierra Leone is almost the second most peaceful nation in West Africa. For things like this to have happened yesterday was very, very unfortunate. It was very, very unfortunate. And many are accusing the security intelligence of not working, of not handling the intelligence properly. Because there were rumors going around that there would be a demonstration. And even as we are now, there is still rumor of there going to be continued the demonstration. So that's why most people are indoors, companies have shut down. But the funny thing is, just today after the protest, there is a small reduction in the price of fuel. Government has announced a reduction in the price of fuel this afternoon.
Okay.
So it's quite funny.
Thank you very much, Abdul Malik Bangura.
Some of the driving forces towards the price hike in Sierra Leone.
Thank you very much, Abdul Malik Bangura. Always a pleasure talking to you. I do appreciate your time and insights. I will definitely keep in touch with you, and as we monitor the shaky and volatile situation in the Republic of Sierra Leone. Thanks again for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're watching Secure the Continent here on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we will be looking at the situation in Chad, where the government has signed a peace deal with more than 40 opposition groups in Doha, the capital of Qatar. We'll bring you details of that and then introduce our guest as we look into that. You're welcome back to Secure the Continent and News Central Television. We now turn our attention to Chad, where the government has signed a peace deal with more than 40 opposition groups in Qatar. Although a few rebel groups, including the biggest one, Front for Change and Concord in Chad, a fact which is the country's main group, did not participate in the peace deal aimed at the national reconciliation of the country. We have more details for you in this package.
For decades, Chad has battled insurgents and rebels on all fronts. Constant violence has left thousands of Chadians homeless. The year of suffering and ceaseless attacks have made the situation a seemingly hopeless one. But the situation has not been without intervention. France has stepped into the situation with Operation Barkhane.
Tu désignes le secteur LGI de Grenade. Explode!
Is one of the military interventions by foreign forces in the country. Former President Idriss Déby Itno, who was killed more than a year ago, was a known friend of France. Marshal Déby, as he was also known, rose through the ranks during the country's war with Libya. However, his leadership of the country was a troubled one. While Déby fought against rebels and led from the front, his ties with the French weren't acceptable to all Chadians. He was killed by FACT rebels, a group of former soldiers believed to have strong links with Russia. His death brought the emergence of his son Mahatma Déby as Chad's leader. Now, the head of Chad's Transitional Military Council, the young Déby, has since dissolved parliament and is ruling as military leader. His government has signed a peace agreement with about 40 rebel groups, hoping to tame the violence. Could this be the beginning of a return to peace for Chad? Will the agreement hold?
Now, joining me tonight in Secure the Continent to analyse the situation in Chad is Dr. Nathaniel Powell, Africa analyst at Oxford Analytica and a researcher at the Centre for War and Diplomacy. He joins us live from Aberystwyth in Wales. He's also the author of the book France's War in Chad, Military Intervention and Decolonization in Africa. Thank you very much for joining me on the programme, Nat.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, Nathaniel, what's the genesis of this fighting in Chad that has been going on since independence and the proliferation of rebel groups? How did it get to this point?
Well, it goes back 50 years. It goes back to the mid-1960s when you start having a series of rebellions against the government, which you have to remember in the early 1960s, this was the country just gained its independence from France, and France was still playing a very important role in helping to govern the country. And the governance or misgovernance of the country led to lots of uprisings against the Chadian regime in the 1960s. And they eventually won in the late 70s and early 80s. But then the new governments that took power then spawned their own rebellions through the ways that they governed the country as well. And throughout this whole process, of course, France played a role in protecting almost every government that took power in N'Djamena against its enemies. And Déby, the father of the current president, Idriss Déby, was in power from 1990 all the way until last year. with the support of France for most of that time, or really all of that time. And the way that he governed the country also generated lots of rebellions as well, which kind of peaked in a series of major conflicts, which actually reached Jamena itself in 2006 and 2008, but continued at a lower level and a lower intensity until the present, with some flare-ups. The biggest flare-up, of course, was last year when the FACT, the rebel group that was based in Libya, managed to reach, well, it didn't reach Jamena, but it reached a couple hundred kilometers from Jamena and was and ended up killing Idris Deby in a battle. At least that's the version that we're all familiar with. And since then, there's been a transitional process where the son of Idris Deby took power with a junta of 15 or so generals, and has begun this national dialogue process, which hasn't actually begun, as a prelude to this national dialogue, which is supposed to include opposition parties and civil society organizations. The government, the new government, wanted to reach an agreement with the different rebel groups that existed, and there are 53 or 52 that were at the Doha meeting, and of those, 43 signed the agreement.
Now,
and that's where we are right now.
Yes, thank you, Nathaniel. Now, talking about those that signed the agreement, this is not the first time in the history of Chad that the government will be having some type of peace deal with rebel groups. Are you hopeful that this meeting in Doha, this signing of the accord, will bring about lasting peace to the people of Chad?
Hopeful, yes. But as you know, you don't have to be a real connoisseur of Chadian history to suspect that this probably will not be the case. The big fear, so the two of the biggest rebel groups, so FACT, and then a break off of the FACT faction, the CCMSR, also based in northern Chad, didn't sign. And there were a couple other smaller formations that didn't sign as well. And the reasons why they didn't sign are actually shared by some of the civilian opposition in Jamena, who are also opposed to the dialogue process. And their argument, which unfortunately I think is relatively accurate, is that this wasn't a peace agreement in the sense that people may have hoped for or may have been led to believe. It's more of a combination of a ceasefire and a co-opting of a lot of the leadership of a lot of these rebel groups into the transitional process in exchange for amnesty, restitution of property that had been seized, promises of integration into the military and all the benefits that may involve, and potential, future promises of holding office that has enticed a lot of these groups into signing the agreement. The other issue is that, you look at the number of groups involved in this meeting. There's something like over 50 rebel groups. The vast majority of them are just generals without armies. And this is not the first time that Chad has had conferences, peace conferences, in which you have a multiplicity of rebel groups that are not really rebel groups, but individuals or collections of individuals that may actually be close to the government in some ways, but it's a way of kind of dividing the opposition and also kind of sharing out resources. But it doesn't actually lead to peace, because the fundamental issues that lead to rebellion, the recurring cycle of rebellion, aren't addressed in any way.
Now, the main opposition group, the main rebel group, FACT, didn't attend the Doha talks for a number of reasons. They say some of the demands have not been met. Nathaniel, what kind of demands are they making beyond the release of prisoners? And how worrying is it that the FACT rebel group isn't signing onto this agreement? This is like hosting a football World Cup and you don't have Brazil and Argentina and England, for example. Yeah.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd say they're a very important rebel group. I'm not sure, and they're the most prominent. I'm not sure you could say they are necessarily the most important.
Yes.
The two important formations did sign, the UFR and the UFDG, which were important formations, and they did sign. But yeah, so the FACT's demands and the CCMSR's demands relate to liberating political prisoners. So FACT has about 400 prisoners that were captured during the fighting last year and are still in prison. But other issues they want addressed is a reconfiguration of the management committee of the dialogue process. They say it's it's dominated by the transitional military authorities, and they want it to be more representative of the population as a whole. They also want a more equal representation in the dialogue. So at the moment, so the national dialogue is supposed to start on August 20th. That's supposed to eventually come up with a new process for transitioning Chad into civilian rule. In fact, the rebel group wants a relatively equal representation of the opposition within that dialogue. And right now, the opposition claims that of about 1,400 people that are supposed to take part in this dialogue, something like 1,200 of them are associated in some way or another with the transitional military authorities, which overwhelmingly loads this process in the favor of those who are still in power. They also, the fact is also, they want to make sure that nobody involved in the transitional process can present themselves for new elections whenever the elections happen. That they won't be able to run for office. So Mohamed Debi will not be able to run for office again. And he's never promised that he he said publicly that he wouldn't, but he's never.
Yeah, we know how these things work, especially
yes, we know how these things work
in these parts of the world.
Not just these parts of the world.
Yes. Now, looking at the demands and what you've just said, it looks like a bunch of generals and the central government in N'Djamena. It's almost like a peace deal, and it's almost like a quid pro quo. Everybody wants something and they're getting something, but where does the will of the ordinary Chadians come in? What are the sentiments on the ground in N'Djamena and other cities from ordinary Chadians about this peace process? Yes.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's hard for me to say, sitting in Wales, what the ordinary Chadian says about the peace process. My sense from reading Chadian media and talking to people who live there is that there is hope that the agreement with the rebel groups can lead to a reduction in the possibilities of instability in the country, and there is a hope, particularly among civil society activists in N'Djamena, that we're not connected to the rebellion in any of the rebel groups really in any way, that the dialogue process, which is supposed to follow this, can lead to a properly representative and inclusive transition. In fact, the word inclusive is in the name of the dialogue. Yes. But I think there's a lot of cynicism about whether or not this is going to happen. In fact, the main opposition kind of coalition of civil society groups and political parties and trade unions and activists is called Wakit Tama. And their leaders were arrested in May. And it's not a rebel group. It's a
political opposition.
Yeah, exactly. Mainly Southerners, which is another issue in Chad. Kind of this opposition between the North and the South, but in N'Djamena mostly urban. So the leadership was arrested. They were released with a suspended sentence after a series of protests that they had been involved in. They were focused on France, actually, and French support for the government. And they are at the moment not. I've decided. Well, at least as far as I know, I've decided not to sit in the dialogue process because they think it's not. It's not going to be democratic or representative in any way, and that may actually stall it may actually lead to another postponement of the dialogue, which may happen. I mean, it's set for the 20th of August to begin, and there are open questions whether it actually begins then.
Now, Nathaniel, looking at the central government in N'Djamena, are they negotiating from a position of strength? Because you have facts, just listing out all those demands. Some you would say are reasonable, some I doubt if Idris Deby, the son, would accept them. My question to you is this: does the Chadian army have the capacity to rein on these rebel groups if they refuse to come to the dialogue table? And is there a military option to keep the peace in Chad if dialogue doesn't work? And how did that play out in the past? Yes.
That's a very good question. It's hard to answer in a definitive way. What is interesting is in 2018, 2019, Mohamed Deby at the time was the head of the Presidential Guard, which is the elite section of the military. Was in charge of suppressing one of these rebel groups, the CCMSR, and he didn't succeed. He didn't do a very good job. And Chadian military operations against FACT have not been particularly successful. FACT failed for lots of reasons. Part of it was logistical; they ran out of fuel, and they didn't have enough troops, and they were victims of their own success in a lot of ways. But and they themselves may not be in a position again to repeat even the success that they had last year. But I don't think the military is in a position to defeat them on the battlefield either, which means that it means two things. One, there isn't an immediate threat to the regime, to the government, but there is a lasting possibility of kind of sustained low-intensity conflict,
Yes.
which could erupt and become dangerous at some point in the future.
Now, Nathaniel, looking at the country, Chad, what role does it play in maintaining peace in the Lake Chad Basin and the Sahel? Because I know they're part of the G5 Sahel group and the multinational joint task force. How important of a role does Chad play in securing this area militarily?
Well, their military, or I should say part of their military, the military is actually, it's often described as a two-speed army, because you have one part of it, which is the Presidential Guard built up under Debbie Father, yes. And they are very well equipped, very well trained, and very experienced. Then you have the rest of the army, which is generally underpaid, is an assemblage of different rebel groups that have kind of integrated into a regular army, which isn't particularly well maintained or supplied, have to live off the population and where they're posted. And can themselves be a source of instability and rebellion at different times. But the Presidential Guard, the DGSIE, mm-hmm. they have been instrumental in several regional security actions. One is Operation Serval, the initial French military intervention in Mali to defeat jihadist groups that had taken over the northern part of the country in 2013. And they played a key role in some of the battles against jihadist groups there. And then they are a core part of MINUSMA, the peacekeeping operation in Mali. And then, of course, as you well know, they're a key part of the regional struggle against Boko Haram with the Joint Task Force. And then more regionally in the Sahel, they were a key member, probably the only really operational member of the G5. Well, Niger to some extent is as well. And have contributed troops to fighting against ISGS and JNIM jihadists in the tri-border region of Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso. I think they probably were not operating in Burkina Faso, but in Niger and Mali, they certainly were. So in that sense, as an auxiliary to the French and to local governments, they've been quite effective. The flip side of that is that these units that are quite elite have also been implicated in lots of human rights abuses and allegations of human rights abuses, which can, of course, be detrimental to the overall goal of suppressing jihadist groups.
So the role of Chad and its army is quite important in keeping the security in the country and also in the West Africa sub-region. Now, let's look at this accords this peace deal that happened in Doha. If they failed, or if the rebel groups renege on the agreement or the government, what are the implications for security in the wider region and Chad itself?
Well, the history of Chad has been a cycle of rebellions, essentially. I mean, one part of Chadian's history is other nicer issues, nicer parts of it as well. But and having these rebel groups out there is a constant threat to, and they've almost overthrown the government on several occasions. So there's that constant threat, which always weighs in the government. And if they could find some way to neutralize that, that allows them to free up resources to do other things, either for the benefit of the population or for their own benefit. The other issue is if they were unable to reach an agreement, that would have potentially reduced the level of legitimacy they can claim when they sit at the table for the national dialogue. And that's, so it's a political issue next to that as well. One thing I would say, though, that has generally not talked about openly, but the actual threat posed by these rebel groups in the short term is relatively limited, because I think the French are providing an implicit security guarantee to the regime that if any of these rebel groups do what FACT did before, they will intervene. And they did that in 2019. Yeah, but don't you think,
looking at what is going on in Mali and the general growing sentiment, anti-French sentiment in West Africa, that the French might not have an appetite for that, putting boots on the ground in Africa and intervening in their domestic affairs?
It's very possible. I think the issue rolls around what it would involve. In 2019, they just intervened with some airstrikes, and that seemed to do the trick. Had they done the same thing in 2021, that also would have done the trick, because we're not talking about a rebellion that's a guerrilla.
Yes, it's low intensity.
Yeah, so we're talking about columns of pickup trucks that you can just knock out from the air, and the French are very capable of doing that. And that's something that they could. I'd imagine they'd be able to do again, or would do again. They have an air base in N'Djamena. They don't want to see any. Chad has been a pillar of France's regional security policy for decades, but especially in the past decade. And they've been exceptionally fearful that anything happens to a government there that would stop being friendly to France. And that is more important to them regionally than any other country, I would say, for any other country. So they can lose Mali, but they wouldn't. They put up more resistance to losing Chad, let's put it that way.
And also Niger Republic, for reasons best known to us. Now, I'm happy you mentioned France. You're the author of a book, France's War in Chad. How involved has the international community been in reaching this accord? And there's always talks of, African solutions to African problems. And this meeting happened in Doha, in Qatar. So what's the role of the international community? How is this different from what has happened in the past? And is France involved in these negotiations in any way?
So I'll take a Doha angle first. So for one thing, Qatar has always had a close relationship with the Debbies. And in fact, two of the rebel leaders, Timam and Tom Erdimi, actually were in exile in Doha, but were not allowed to leave Qatar for the past decade. Tom was allowed to leave, then he's been arrested in Egypt. Nobody knows what happened to him since. And I think from the perspective of both the rebel groups and from the government in Chad, it was the idea of holding a dialogue with rebel groups in Chad just wasn't on the table. There's judicial issues, there's security issues. No rebel leader is going to risk going to N'Djamena without serious security guarantees about their own personal security.
Understandable.
So it's understandable they're going to want to have a conference somewhere else. And Qatar has been trying to play a mediating role all over the continent, not just in Africa, but elsewhere. And they have lots of money, and it benefits them in terms of soft power and in terms of potential contracts. I don't really know, but they have all these personal connections to N'Djamena and some of the rebels. So it was, I think, for a lot of the Chadian leaders involved on both sides, it was a logical place to hold a conference. As for the French dimension, I think the French have basically stayed out of it. This is kind of, as far as they're concerned,
they're just observers.
They're just observers, and Mohamed Dabi, as long as he's managing it in a way that doesn't destabilize the country. I mean, the French I think are positive about it. They think that it's important to come to an agreement with these groups to ensure the longer-term stability of the country, which is important to France. But I think had the French gotten more involved, that could have been counterproductive. So I think they just hands off. I don't think the French were involved in this in any way, in any direct way, at least.
Now, Nathaniel, these agreements in Doha were meant to set the talks for a broader national dialogue set for August the 24th. That's in less than 2 weeks. What is the aim of these dialogues, and what does it hope to achieve? Because we're seeing Mohamed Dabi as, Mohamed Dabi, the peacemaker, unlike his dad there, had a more militaristic approach to solving problems. What's the crux of this national dialogue that is meant to happen?
Well, ostensibly, it's to create the conditions, the legal and political framework for a transition to civilian rule, or back to civilian rule, or to civilian rule that is democratic and representative and broadly legitimate. And the hope on all sides well, maybe not on all sides, but the hope among many is that could be the case. That this would then lead. Initially, the idea is there would be elections within 18 months of the transition, so that would be October.
You don't think it's happening?
No, I think it's almost, for that to happen, you'd have to have a census, you'd have to have an independent electoral commission be established with commissioners, and you'd have to have the infrastructure put in place, and none of that's happened yet. So I think it's clear that it's essentially been said already that this transition process is going to be extended. And the question is, how much buy-in can they get the opposition to agree to? And I think I'm pretty sure Deby and the government are willing to give something to the opposition, but they're not really in a position to give away the state. And you have huge elements within the army, within the military, and within the Deby family, and people associated with those groups that essentially their security and livelihoods depend on the system remaining as it is in all of its kind of, at least, they're fine with cosmetic changes, but at the end of the day, they can't fundamentally change. Otherwise, you're going to have, you could have a military mutiny, you could have, return to civil war, you could have in any case, their livelihoods would be threatened. So they're not going to be willing to give away much, even if you assume the best of intentions among, with Mohammed Deby and those around him. There's only so much they can give away before you're talking about fundamental interests that are going to be threatened. So, the question is, how much of this is cosmetic? How much can the opposition manage to, snatch away? The other issue, which I should have gone back to, is that by coming to an agreement with the rebel groups, that also removes an element of pressure that the opposition in a way has to try to pull concessions away from the government during the dialogue process. So there is probably less of a chance now that they're going to come to an agreement that is really, I wouldn't say less of a chance, it's not going to happen anyway, but going to come to a broadly democratic consensus or resolution. And I hate to be cynical about this, but Chad's history is not.
They're not the most democratic of states, and looking at their history. Now, talking about elections in Chad, you and I know that this 18-month transition period that Mohammed Deby proposed when he took over power is ending next month, and there's no chance in this world that elections will happen. What is, in your opinion, a reasonable timeline for elections to happen? And will elections be, looking at the history of Chad, the silver bullet to solve all its security and economic problems?
Those are very tough questions. The dialogue could last months. So this isn't the first time Chad's had a comprehensive, inclusive national dialogue. It happened under Deby Sr. in the early 1990s in the Sovereign National Conference, like many African countries did in the early 1990s. And it just, there was a democratic opening for a while, which then closed, and Deby managed to kind of retain power. And that's, and the son rather has much more control over this process than his father did in the early 90s, which is why I'm more pessimistic about the outcome. But assuming that there is a move towards, more democratic, say fully representative elections, again, that's not necessarily going to bring peace and stability to the country. But what it could do, it could democratize the state to the extent that you might have a sharing out of resources that is a bit more equitable than what you have now. But no, that doesn't. Democracy democracy and stability are nice when they come together. They don't always come together, right? And sometimes they can undermine each other. So it's and you can't even say democracy is necessary for stability. But I prefer a stability with democracy than a stability without democracy, and I think lots of other people would too. Whether that's going to happen or not is an open question. I think it's not an open question. I think it's not going to happen.
Now, Nathaniel, in 2018, the Chadian parliament overwhelmingly approved a new constitution that expands President Idris Deby, late President Idris Deby's powers, and potentially allowed him to stay in power until 2033. But it died in battle last year, and this vote was boycotted by most opposition lawmakers. Now, one of the steps is believed to be taken soon by the government of his son, Mohammed Deby, is the drafting of a new constitution. How difficult will that be to accomplish, looking at the current negotiations and the current situation in the country?
Well, it depends on how much control he has over the dialogue process. It could be very difficult. Usually when it becomes very difficult, the standard operating procedures, you appoint or find a way to appoint a smaller number of people who then, write the Constitution, and you submit it to a national referendum, and you make sure that this is something you're going to win. And this is, I think that's probably what's going to happen. That, there's going to be perhaps the dialogue process there'll be a set of principles that will emerge. Some of them probably reasonably progressive, and then there's going to be some kind of constituent assembly that's going to be either elected or appointed, and that will then draft the Constitution. And then, I think assuming...
So the Constitution comes before elections?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, in theory, I mean, this hasn't been made explicit, but presumably, so my understanding, which could be wrong, but is that the Sovereign National Dialogue is looking to amend the transitional charter in a way that's seen as broadly legitimate and inclusive, then to lead to elections, either for a constituent assembly to create a constitution, or I think to a new government, and then that would lead to a constitution. But it's not clear to me, and I think it's deliberately kind of fluid and up in the air.
I guess it's buy more time for the regime. Now, before I let you go, Nathaniel, this talks in Doha failed to happen in the first step, and it finally happened. You have over 50 rebel groups signing a peace agreement, even though a significant rebel group was not there. Are you hopeful that this just concluded signing of the peace deal in Doha will stop or reduce the fighting to some significant level?
I think in the short term it will. But I need to say that there's a lot of these rebel groups have been effectively dormant for several years, except for FACT, the CCMSR, and a couple smaller ones. But the two main ones in the East, the UFTD and the UFR, haven't done much. So in the purest security sense, it actually doesn't change much because it doesn't neutralize the two groups in the north. It just kind of reduces the potential for kind of efforts to spoil the peace talks from other groups. So in that sense, it probably does provide a measure of short-term stability or security, but I think only at the margins and only short-term.
Now, we can't have this program without talking about the humanitarian impact of the fightings by various rebel groups and the stability of the country of Chad. How bad is the situation, and what are some of the humanitarian consequences of this fighting with this multitude of rebel groups in the country?
Right. So first of all, Chad is not Mali or Niger or Burkina Faso. You don't have widespread, deeply anchored guerrilla movements that are contesting state authority in an organized sense, like jihadist groups are in the Sahel and other parts of the Sahel. But most of these rebel groups are based outside of the country, and most of their fighters are out of the country or very kind of at the margins of the country. At the same time, you do have a lot of local conflicts. In fact, this isn't discussed much at all, but in Mayokebi, for instance, prefecture, which is in the south, there is substantial levels of herder-farmer violence, which doesn't involve rebel groups at all, but is driving thousands of people away from their homes. And you also, in eastern Chad, you have similar kinds of conflicts. And this is a level of recurrent instability at the local level that none of the stuff we've been talking for the past half hour was going to really address. And that's the kind of instability that most Chadians are experiencing on a daily basis in rural areas, and in urban areas you have, of course, the normal problems like crime and poverty and things like that. But Chad as a whole is, there's a potential food crisis coming this year because of drought, and the diversion of international humanitarian aid because of the war in Ukraine means that humanitarian appeals are going to not come close to reaching their desired amount of resources, and that's going to have longer-term impacts. Not to mention the food and fuel inflation of prices that we're experiencing everywhere. It's definitely impacting Chad as well. And this is going to further add to the potential for a deeper negative humanitarian impact in the coming months and years.
I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Dr. Nathaniel Powell, Africa Analyst at Oxford Analytica and researcher at the Center of War and Diplomacy in Lancaster. Thank you very much for your insights and candor. We do appreciate your time and contribution to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Now, while Chad has mostly avoided violence in a period of uncertainty, the situation could become more perilous. Delaying the transition could shatter the brittle trust among the country's main stakeholders. National and international actors must strive to maintain consensus and others to see the transition through within the agreed time frame. International stakeholders, notably the African Union, relevant member states and France, should make concerted efforts to encourage Chad's authorities to apply these measures. Thank you very much for joining us in the program today. On behalf of the team and I say thank you for watching. I'm Gbenga Aborowa. See you next time and secure the continent here on News Central Television, where we put Africa first.